Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Christina Bain, and I am the director of the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery here at Babson College. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this really important conversation about responsible recruitment versus the human trafficking of migrant workers, which is something that's critically relevant today, given the ongoing migration crisis that we are experiencing. And we're going to be broadcasting from Babson. I'm joined by my colleague and dear friend, Julie Dahlstrom from Boston University, who's going to be moderating today, and I'll be introducing her later in the program. And for now, I want to just thank our partners on this webinar series. This is a series, and we're lucky to have the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center working with us today to put on these webinars. And this is our second webinar in the series, and we'll be having another webinar and a webinar every month until July. So thank you for joining us, for those of you who joined us for our first webinar. And now I'm going to also show you, this is the website for the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center. That's also one of our co-sponsors with this. I want to thank Dr. Louise Shelley, who's been a dear mentor and friend, who's been working with us on promoting these webinars. This is also located at George Mason University. So to tell you a bit about the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery and how we began, this initiative is located here at Babson, which is an entrepreneurship-focused business school with undergraduate and graduate students in a number of programs. And the theory behind the initiative was to bring together entrepreneurial minds, students, and business leaders, corporate NGO and governmental partners, and human trafficking and modern slavery activists around the globe to really bring together in convening, learning, networking, and building innovative approaches to human trafficking and advancing human freedom, looking at business and what the business sector can do to fight this egregious human rights abuse. We're also looking at leveraging expertise and resources from the college to develop research, classroom approaches, and action-oriented initiatives to educate and activate current and next-generation business leaders in the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery. And we're thrilled to really bring together all of these leaders and put on this webinar series here today. Here's our new website. That we have. It's still a work in progress, but the basics are up there, and I hope you'll take a look at it. It's www.babson.edu/IHTMS, and please check it out when you have a moment. So now I want to also thank our technical folks who are here with us today at Babson, John Florendo and Admeet Kalra, who are working to make sure that this conference runs smoothly from the technical side. Thank you so much for your work today on this. And now I want to introduce Livia Wagner, who is the private sector advisor for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And we're going to give the ball to you, Livia.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining our second webinar, and also thanking all the presenters. We are very excited to have you here. I'm going to briefly introduce the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. The Global Initiative is a network of prominent law enforcement and governance and development experts. And it was formally launched in September 2013. And now the network has more than 100 independent global and regional experts working on law enforcement, human rights, democracy, governance, and development issues. And we're registered as an international nonprofit organization in Geneva. Our objectives are threefold. The first one is strategic. We would like to promote more effective joined-up responses, but also analytical, meaning that we want to raise awareness and open the debate about the nature, the extent, impact, and solutions of organized crime. And also responsive. That means we want to serve as a source partner with regional and national players. And our substantive priorities are, we're focusing mainly on 8 forms of organized crime around the globe. And I personally, I'm working mainly on human trafficking. And the genesis of the global initiative is that the GI was conceived after a series of closed forum discussions with senior law enforcement officers, experts from multilateral organizations, and development practitioners, as well as policymakers. And the participants, they called for a network of experts to serve as a necessary tool to develop a more strategic and global approach to counter organized crime. As the participants, they concluded that until now, transnational organized crime is not very well analyzed or understood, and sometimes or very often not systematically integrated in national action plans. And existing forms of cooperation tend to be bilateral or restricted to a limited number of states. So therefore, the GI could and should serve as an incubator for new integrated strategies. And our work on human trafficking is, there is an urgency of developing collaborative approaches addressing human trafficking. And our research has focused mainly on human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. And there is also one publication that you can find on the website, The Smuggled Futures, The Dangerous Path to the Migrants from Africa to Europe. As well, we're going to launch very soon a comparative analysis on illegal mining in Latin America and the nexus between illegal gold mining and organized crime such as human trafficking, for instance. And for us, it's very important to engage with the private sector as we acknowledge their important role to also counter human trafficking. And I also wanted to say that we're going to do some live tweeting about this webinar, so you can find us on Twitter at GI_TOC. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Livia, for your great presentation and for your wonderful partnership on these webinars. So now I want to just have a technical session just to say to everyone that you're able to send in your questions to the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And as we have each presenter speak and send in their presentations, I want to encourage you to send in your questions so we have a great number of questions by the time we get to our discussion portion, which will be around 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So it'll be about an hour of presentations and then questions. So continue to send in your questions as the speakers are making their remarks, and we'll get to those during the question and answer session. So now I want to introduce our moderator for today, Julie Dahlstrom, who is here with us from Boston University. She's a clinical instructor at the Human Trafficking Clinic and also a senior staff attorney at Casa Mirna Vasquez, which is doing really incredible work here in the Boston area related to domestic violence, human trafficking, et and really she's a trailblazer on these issues. So you can see from her slide that she oversees the university's School of Law clinic, and I will say that as a Boston University alumna, I'm thrilled to have seen Julie and the clinic profiled in our recent alumni magazine, so she's been really acknowledged for this tremendous work. She's also an affiliated faculty member with Boston University's Party School of Global Studies initiative on forced migration and human trafficking, which is a brand new initiative within the Party School that is growing by leaps and bounds and has some tremendous resources for students, staff, and faculty, not only at the university, but at other schools in the Boston area and globally. And they've been putting on some great events as well. She's also representing survivors of commercial sexual exploitation at Casa Mirna Vasquez, and previously she was the managing attorney of the Immigration Legal Assistance Program at Essentia Care Alliance, and I can say that Julie is really one of the top experts in Massachusetts and also really in the United States on labor trafficking. She's also been recognized and serving on the Human Trafficking Task Force here in Massachusetts. We're lucky to have her with us today, and she's going to be moderating our dynamic panel of experts and guiding through us the discussion. So now I'm going to leave this over to Julie.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christina, for that generous introduction. And thank you to the Batson Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery, as well as the Global Initiative, for really hosting this important focus on ethical recruitment today. I think too often, and for good reason, the focus is on human trafficking, these abuses, and how do we have enforcement mechanisms that are practical and effective. And today we have the opportunity really to step back and look at recruitment practices that in many ways make these abuses possible. So it's incredibly important work, and I'm happy and excited to hear from our panelists. As many of you all know, if there was full transparency, it's very possible that companies wouldn't engage in these practices, and that migrants wouldn't select dangerous work placements. And so what we're going to learn more about today is how do we make that world possible. For a second, I want to move forward, here we go, to zoom back a little bit and look at this through the international migration lens, which Christina mentioned. So we all know that we are facing a world with increased inequality where there is greater migration, 106 million working in another country, and increasingly in the media and academia, the focus is on these pull and push factors. So right now, as Christina mentioned, the Syrian migrant crisis, and as we haven't mentioned, in Latin America, gang violence and others are causing a greater population of individuals to flee and to face a very hostile reception in host countries. But today we have the opportunity really to focus on recruitment practices and exploitation that may befall these migrants as they are traveling. Essentially what's happening when these unscrupulous actors prey upon this population and where legal action has been really ineffective to a large part. I want to just focus on, there's been more recently discussion about maritime waters and how trafficking is occurring here in this sort of legal black zone. And in some ways, recruitment is very similar. So we have a place, a legal zone where it's difficult to have legal action, where individuals are increasingly vulnerable to exploitation, and where in some ways there's a great opportunity through ethical recruitment practices to act and to prevent trafficking. And that's what many of the panelists are doing on the ground here today. What is the international construct or structure? Here, the good news is there are voluntary codes of practice or non-binding instruments which really lay out standards for businesses and lay the groundwork for these ethical practices. We see also emerging regional ethical principles, so the DACA principles, Athens ethical principles, and codes of conduct within specific industries like health workers. But what's needed now are really effective practices to fill the gaps and perhaps more binding laws, which we'll talk a little bit about, that promote transparency. So the question remains sort of how do you incentivize or punish bad actors? So we have a situation where companies may benefit in the short term from closing their eyes and not knowing really about these ineffective or unethical recruitment practices, and where in fact they may be benefiting financially when migrants are paying the fees that they would otherwise pay. And so how do we create systems that incentivize companies to promote transparency, to know about these practices, when there may be a benefit in the short term to not? So what do we see in terms of the nature of the problem? We have these failing legal systems, so maybe legal systems that aren't equipped to address recruitment practices, increasingly corruption, so even where there are laws, government officials are turning a blind eye, and incredible cross-jurisdictional problems in terms of this spanning across countries, across continents, and difficulty really in capturing or enforcing current laws. And then what is the result of that? So in some ways, yes, unscrupulous actors, but in other ways, perhaps very calculating actors who are operating by the market that allows them to fill the gap and very much profit. So how do we create incentives as well for recruitment companies to act ethically and for them to really bear the cost of not doing so? So what is exciting is there are these promising practices that many of the panelists are going to speak about today that really leverage the shared goals of workers and companies. So we were talking about maybe a short-term incentive to use recruitment companies that may be unethical, but there are also goals that companies have in terms of protecting their brand, and obviously workers have in having the most information in front of them when they make a decision to travel. And what I find really exciting is global companies can do perhaps what law cannot in spanning countries and really promoting ethical practices where it may be difficult to enforce laws in that context. So what do we see? An array of companies, initiatives, nonprofits who are really working on cutting-edge projects, and I'm not going to go into them now because I think our panelists are going to speak at length about them, in terms of leading the way with what is ethical recruitment and also how do we incentivize companies to participate. And to some extent, we see the law both responding to and also these efforts sort of responding to law reform efforts to promote transparency. So this highlights, for example, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. There have been other acts that really promote companies to report efforts to prevent and root out human trafficking. So we have an opportunity now to allow the law to support these ethical practices. And other examples of that include the UK Bribery Act, which was in 2010, executive orders in the US, the Modern Slavery Act, and we're hoping as well the Federal Transparency and Supply Chain Act that remains pending in the US. So what questions remain? So many questions remain, and I hope that our panelists will have some time today to address them. What are the emerging best practices in this field? What are the limitations of a voluntary approach in which companies are not maybe mandated by law in certain contexts to participate in ethical recruitment? Will this marginalize bad actors? Will we be able to sort of internalize the costs in a way that cause bad actors to not engage in these practices? And how can the law support these efforts? So with that, I would love to pass the ball to our esteemed presenter, Clara Pascual de Vargas. She is a consultant for the International Organization on Migration, which has really been leading the way in anti-trafficking work for a very long time in both combating trafficking and serving survivors of trafficking and also preventative efforts. She's currently working as a consultant for the Labor Mobility and Human Development Division of IOM, which is really engaging in cutting-edge work in this area. She provides technical expertise on issues related to ethical labor recruitment and labor exploitation. And prior to joining IOM, she had a wide variety of counter-trafficking experience. She's really going to talk about an exciting new initiative at IOM looking at ethical recruitment. And with that, I will turn it over to her to begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much for this introduction. And I'd also like to thank you, the Babson College, and the Geneva Initiative for this great opportunity that we have to present the IRACE initiative in this webinar. I'd like to start by giving a short introduction of the International Organization for Migration for those of you among the attendees and maybe you've never heard of it or don't really know what is it. The International Organization for Migration is the leading intergovernmental organization for issues related to migration. It is an international, as I said, it's an intergovernmental organization, so it's comprised of member states. And although it's not a United Nations body, it's not a UN agency, it works very closely with the UN. The organization was created in 1951 with a primarily humanitarian mandate. It was created in principle to assist the movement of displaced people arising from World War II. And it's been evolving since then. And the organization, while it remains very operational and leverages more than 400 offices globally, has a wide range of activities and a wider mandate than just the emergency mandate. The IOM is also working with governments, with the private sector and civil society organizations to improve migration management. And it's actually in the context of migration management, and specifically in the context of preventing exploitation of migrant workers, that the IOM has been working in the last few years with different stakeholders, and particularly with the private sector, to address the risks associated to unethical recruitment practice and its impact on migrant workers. We understand that recruitment is often the first step in the labor migration process, and when it's operating transparently, when recruiters are operating transparently and ethically, recruitment intermediaries facilitate labor mobility. But when it's done unethically and includes practices such as fee charging, document retention, contract substitution, it can lead to situations of labor exploitation, and in the worst cases can lead to cases of human trafficking and forced labor in their supply chains. So it's actually out of the realization of the devastating impact that these unethical recruitment practices can have on migrant workers that the IOM, that has on migrant workers, not only on migrant workers, but also on employers and on governments, and especially on the recruitment industry itself, that a group of stakeholders, together with the IOM, decide to approach the issue from a more operational perspective. And this operational perspective is what we call, or through the creation of what we call the International Recruitment Integrity System, whose acronym is IRIS. Before I go into more details of IRIS, I would also like to mention that the IOM is also working on other fronts, still within the recruitment, addressing unethical recruitment practices. We're in the last months we've been working closely with the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. And this leadership group is a collaboration between leading companies and expert organizations to drive positive change in the way that migrant workers are recruited. The central objective of the leadership group is to eradicate worker fees by 2020 as a way to combat exploitation, forced labor, and trafficking of migrant workers in global supply chains. They think that due to the demonstrated link between debt bondage and forced labor, the leadership group believes that the cost of recruitment should be borne not by the worker, but by the employer. And this is the reason behind promoting this idea of employer pays model. Beyond this, we're also working with the private sector, and we're working also a little bit beyond the recruitment aspect, but in trying to improve policies within private sectors so migrant workers feel are better protected and better empowered to know their rights at deployment or at the final destination country. But now going into more details of IRIS. So IRIS is a global multi-stakeholder certification system for recruitment intermediaries. The objective of IRIS is really to change the business model. So knowing, not all recruitment, as we will see, and I'm sure my colleagues later will very clearly explain, while there are very good actors, but there are very good actors such as FSI, which will be introduced later, and the CEAT members. There are others, and unfortunately many, that still believe that the business model should be based on a worker-based model. So the idea of IRIS is really to leverage the playing field for those in the industry who are already doing good things, who are already upholding ethical recruitment practices. We want to reinforce the business culture of an employer-based model. And in addition, given that in most cases the international recruitment labor supply chains are often composed of multiple layers that include sub-agents and informal partners who are not disclosed to the end-user company or final employer, which makes it very difficult for companies to exercise the due diligence on their supply chains. IRIS aims to allow these companies to be able to identify recruitment intermediaries with whom they share the same commitment to ethical recruitment practices and allow them to identify who is part of their labor supply chain. So as I said, IRIS is a sustainable certification, or what we know better as sustainable labels, like the Fair Trade or the Marine Stewardship Council. And as a certification system is based on 3 components. So we have the standard, which I'll talk a little bit more later, which is the IRIS Code of Conduct, which basically identifies the requirements for recruitment intermediaries in order to be certified. We have the certification process itself, which is the process flow that assesses the applicant recruitment intermediary level of compliance with the standard and makes a determination on the certification. And finally, the monitoring or the compliance system that after issuance of the certification, it monitors that those recruitment intermediaries that have been certified keep upholding the standards they say they committed to. So the IRIS Code of Conduct, or the IRIS standard, is basically divided in two main components. And we have what we call the two core principles, which especially all of those of you that are familiar as well with the UN Guiding Principles, you will recognize this general principle of respect for laws and what will be the due diligence principle within the respect for ethical and professional conduct. And we have, beyond that, we have the other part, which will be the more operational principles, those that will allow us to establish the criteria and indicators. Generally, the IRIS, what we call the IRIS Code of Conduct, is based on international human rights instruments, the 10 core conventions, and the ILO, obviously the ILO labor standards. The work of the UN in addressing private sector impacts on human rights through the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. The efforts of civil society, such as the DACA Principles for Migration with Dignity, which I think have already been mentioned by both Christine and Julie. But also, we are also trying to incorporate recruitment industry best practice, including the CED Code of Conduct and practices such as those of FSI. And in developing this code of conduct, we obviously, this as a within the multi-stakeholder nature of the certification, this is a collaborative effort, and I'm actually very glad that I'm sharing this webinar with two of our stakeholders that attend those meetings to, as we said, incorporating best practice into the IRIS idea, into the IRIS Code of Conduct. The goal, as we said, going to next. So as I said before, and I won't be tired of repeating this, what we're trying to achieve through IRIS is, first of all, to benefit the recruitment industry. And we want to benefit the recruitment industry by allowing those that are doing a good job to be identified, giving them increased international visibility, and give them really a market advantage. So actually employers are able to identify those recruitment intermediaries who share their commitment to fair recruitment and international labor standards, and also helps them to mitigate their own risks of unforeseen connections to forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking in the supply chains. We believe that IRIS will also help governments. We believe that the certification will help reducing the risk of labor exploitation and modern-day slavery, that we will encourage safe and dignified labor mobility, and we will, through this, through normalizing these benchmarks, that we promote international policy coherence, that we're all going to the same goal, that we're all going to this idea of changing the business model, changing the business culture. And finally, more importantly, we believe IRIS will be able to benefit workers and by incentivizing a business model that minimizes exploitation and abuse, to improve their access to bona fide international employment opportunities, and by promoting transparency in all of the stages of the recruitment process. Talking a little bit about where we are, where we're heading to, and how this IRIS certification is being created and formed. For the time being, at this moment, we are focusing on the technical aspects of the standards and certification process flow. So we're really focusing on creating the benchmark, on addressing the criteria, and identifying indicators, and identifying an optimal process flow that will allow us to identify who's doing a good job, which recruitment intermediaries will be able to be certified. Once we finalize a draft certification model, we will proceed to pilot test it. We believe that this is a process, and as all certification, all sustainable levels, you draft something, you draft a model, you experiment, you evaluate, you reorient. And this is basically the idea of a pilot testing. We will pilot test in selected migration corridors with the primary the primary criteria being that there is an existence of regulatory frameworks that at least will allow us to determine whether this recruitment intermediary that is applying is at least a business or a licensed registered business in the sector, and also migration corridors where we can identify or we can support as well a commitment from employers, because as we said, one of the biggest challenges in changing this business model is to move from the idea of the worker-based model to the employer-based model. And to move to the employer-based model, we really need the commitment from the employer side, and we need to identify those that are willing to help the recruitment industry as well to move into this new business model. On the other hand, as a certification, IRIS is also looking into becoming an independent instructor, and the idea is through governance discussions to find an optimal governance structure that helps to preserve the impartiality and transparency of the certification and ensures a good system of checks and balances. And we obviously will continue the cooperation and engagement with other stakeholders to ensure that we keep on alignment between IRIS and other international efforts in promoting ethical recruitment practices. Finally, I'd also like to thank, obviously, many of our partners that are part of this initiative. Not all of them are in this slide, but especially the Swiss Confederation has been a great support in financing this initiative, and the International Organization of Employers has been also a great support been with this from the beginning. And I'd like to thank you all for listening to me. And please, any questions, any issues, please don't hesitate to write. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Clara, for highlighting the practices of IOM, which is really leading the way in developing best practices, but also, as you mentioned, sort of confronting head-on the pragmatic challenges of developing these approaches. So thank you. Thank you for sharing, and my hope is our presenters will be following up on some of the points that you have made. Just a friendly reminder to those who are participating in the panel today and listening, please continue to send in your questions. After the panel is finished, we will be addressing all of your questions and hoping that our panelists will help us to do so. So now I want to introduce James Sinclair. We're so lucky to have him join us today. He's the co-founder of and an international advisor to the FSI Worldwide Group of Companies, which you've heard mentioned throughout the presentation thus far. He's an international lawyer and academic researcher based in London, who, in addition to his robust legal practice, is also undertaking a part-time PhD at King's College in London, which is really looking at profitable ethics, the relationship between eradication of slavery and enhanced commercial performance. In 2006, he co-founded FSI Worldwide, which is really an innovative, cutting-edge program that's been recognized by the UN GIFT program and also others. Its initial focus was on protecting the rights of former military personnel working in post-conflict and hostile environments, and really has been seen as a model in other contexts. I also wanted to mention that he's been working on a new Geneva initiative that has the working title of ESPF, which stands for Ethical, Sustainable, and Profitable Future. ESPF is really quite interesting in that it has two components. One, which is a research laboratory looking at academic quality research into the effects of commercial performance of adopting and embracing these ethical workplace practices. And the other is a research lab, which engages in public advocacy and traditional think tank work. And you notice the use of the word lab and think tank, really he is on the forefront of experimentation in these issues and not only research, but applying that research to practice, which is so exciting. FSI, as he'll speak about, has protected many thousands of workers across different geographies and industry sectors. And so with that, I will turn it over to him to talk about some of his groundbreaking work. Thank you.
Julie, thank you very much for your kind words. I hope you don't mind if I put my video on. Can you see me okay?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic.
Yes, we can see you.
I'm just going to bring the slides up if I can. 1 second. Do you have the access to the slides I had earlier?
James, they're right there at the top. Do you see them?
Thank you.
Okay, great.
So first of all, thank you for your introduction. Thank you very much for hosting this afternoon. And thanks to Babson and to the Global Initiative for your work in this area. Really what I'd like to do over the course of the next 10 minutes or so is give you a case study involving FSI worldwide, which, as you say, I was a co-founder of back in 2006. Because FSI is taking a slightly different approach to the issues surrounding human trafficking and forced labor, in as much as we, without putting too fine a point on it, we see it as much as a business opportunity as a human rights initiative. We founded the company in 2006 principally because we wanted to try to protect former Gurkha soldiers who had been serving in the British Army and were then being drafted into serving private security roles in Iraq and Afghanistan during the height of those wars. Many of my co-founders at FSI, including the Chief Executive, Tristan Forster, are former British Army officers. And that's important because they bring to this company a certain, if you like, military can-do attitude of wanting to simply get out there and try and fix the problem. And the problem that they witnessed in both Iraq and Afghanistan was one that was really quite serious, and it involved what we now recognize to be all of the gamut of forced labor and human trafficking issues. I should say when we started the company, our focus was really quite narrow. It was on military personnel, and it was on the migrant route between South Asia, particularly India and Nepal, into the former conflict zones of Iraq and Afghanistan. Since that time, the focus of the company has become significantly broader, and we're looking at a number of issues that surround the human trafficking and forced labor problem. And I'll come on to speak in a few moments about, as you say, ESPF and that project. The most important thing, I think, to understand about FSI in terms of my opening remarks is that it is a vertically integrated company. It's one that seeks to provide a protected corridor for all of the people that we recruit, from the door of their house or of their village all the way through to their job site. And the reason why we think that's so important is because we witnessed exploitation and corruption happening at every stage of the process. So when people were being recruited, they were often, as we all know, asked for significant sums of money. Often they couldn't pay that money, and so they would be exploited throughout that process, and then again throughout the whole of their life as a worker. And so we felt it was very important to have a system that was robust, that was set up in a way that would be able to resist the ever-present forces of corruption and intimidation, and which would provide the best opportunity to protect the workers that we were responsible for recruiting. And I should say FSI is a commercial company. It is out there to make money, to be frank. And the human rights aspect of what FSI does is baked into the business model. And increasingly over time, we have felt that it's important to demonstrate our ethics, absolutely, but we don't go into our client companies and begin with a lecture on human rights. we go in there and seek to demonstrate that ethical practices make good business sense. And that really lies at the heart of the project that I have ongoing, which I'll speak about in a few moments. The number of people that FSI has helped over the last 10 years is about 10,000, as you can see from that slide. Although the exact numbers obviously fluctuate with the various projects that we have ongoing. At the moment, we have a very interesting pilot project in Qatar, which is linked to the construction of the sites for the 2022 World Cup. I'm sure many of you will have read the reports, the very distressing reports, of large numbers of workers being exposed to very bad practice, many dying on those construction sites. And Qatar is a difficult place, if I may put it euphemistically, for workers' rights. However, and we have come under pressure in the past for operating in places like Qatar or Saudi Arabia or the UAE, but we have taken the view that if you wish to make a serious inroad into these problems, you have to deal with the problems where they are, not where you'd like them to be. I'll come on to speak in a few moments about the landscape of policy and if you like, accountability that has increased over the course of the last 10 years. But before I do, it is worth noting that notwithstanding all of the fantastic developments at the policy and the political level in the US and in Europe over the course of the last 6 or 7 years, there remains an awful long way to go to bridge the gap between policy and practice. I don't know whether you have seen, or the attendees to this webinar have seen, the Al Jazeera documentary that you can see on the slide there called Fault Lines. Now that is 2 years old, but I can guarantee that the problems that are described in that program are still endemic. I won't labor the point, because if you wish to look at that documentary, you can find it, I think, on YouTube or on the Al Jazeera channel. But I would recommend you do have a look, because it shows you just how endemic the problems of human trafficking and forced labor are, even on US government contracts. Some might even say especially on US government contracts. And notwithstanding the fact that there have been all of these political changes. The key principles that FSI seeks to operate around really are, as I say, an attempt to bed in human rights culture into recruitment practices in around the world. And now in the US and in the UK and other European countries, happily, it is the case that most of the people employed in most of the companies are treated quite well. And partly that is a result of the legislation and the requirements of not only the law, but of practice and of culture. But it is also the case that those companies, some companies that are based in North America or Europe, have long labour supply chains into Africa or South Asia or South America. And unfortunately, there are some significant problems that exist in some of those areas in terms of workers' rights. And one of the interesting factors that I'll come on to talk about in a moment in relation to the legislative changes we've seen is that there is now a good deal more pressure on directors and shareholders of international companies to ensure that their workers throughout the supply chain, no matter where they are protected and looked after. One of the key cornerstones of the FSI business, as I've said, is that this is not about compliance, and it's not about CSR. It is about baking into all of your recruitment practices and your management practices a respect for human rights. And this is not done because human rights focus is the right thing to do, although it clearly is. It's done very largely because we think that you get a lot of benefit from it as a company. So when we go and talk to clients or potential clients, particularly those who operate in the Middle East, who may be unfamiliar with a culture of human rights, or they may not operate in an ethical way, we try to explain that if you recruit people well, and if you manage them well, then you have better outcomes in terms of productivity, in terms of quality, in terms of being able to differentiate yourself from your competitive opposition. And these are all really important factors in trying to convince commercial companies that they should move to a more ethical system. I'm going to talk very, very quickly now about some of the key aspects of that protected employment corridor that I spoke about in my initial remarks. You'll see from this slide that the first, and I would suggest the most important aspect, is that everyone that is recruited through the FSI model is selected purely on merit. No one pays for their job. And that includes, that is across the board. Now, there may be situations in which we offer specialist training to people, and that training is offered at a discounted rate or with some sort of subsidy given by an international organisation. But that is really the only exception. And FSI is close to unique in that regard in some of the areas that we operate in. So in Nepal, for example, which is the country that we know best and where we started, it is extremely unusual for people to be offered a job without having to pay some sort of bribe or facilitation payment for that job. And when you're talking about a construction job or an engineering job in the Middle East, that amount of money is often somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000. That's obviously a lot of money, and that's money that frequently the recruit will not have. And so there will then follow a process either of the recruit having to get money from his local village or from selling land, or quite often taking debt bondage from a broker who will often be related to the recruitment agent. And the recruitment agent will often have a deal with the human resources departments of the companies in the Middle East who are seeking the workers in the first instance. And so you can see that there is a circle of corrupt payments and exploitation, which leads to the recruit being left in an extremely vulnerable position, because once they have taken on this debt bondage, which often is accompanied by significant interest payments due on the loan, they are vulnerable to further exploitation throughout their life as a worker on the project. And that really is the, if you like, the original sin here, because once a recruit has crossed that Rubicon, once they become bonded, their life becomes extremely difficult, and sometimes for many years thereafter. Not just because they can be intimidated and exploited whilst at the project, but their families remain at risk while they're at home, often with a number of relatives away overseas working. The second part of the principle is the travel protection, because we have noticed through our work that recruits are often exploited on their journeys from their home villages to the job site, and then when they go back on leave or vacation. And so as a result, FSI facilitates their travel and often has senior members of staff traveling with recruits or with workers to ensure that there are no problems during the transit phase. The third is payroll protection, and that is a key aspect of trying to protect workers from exploitative bosses, and sometimes also from themselves, it has to be said. It is important that the worker is paid in full and on time every month. And so with the clients that FSI has, we will often offer and sometimes insist on running the payroll for the client. Often the client's delighted to accept that because it takes a problem off their table, and we ensure that our audited systems are transparent and that all of the money is paid with no deductions every month in full and on time. And this is especially important in circumstances where families back at home rely on the remittance that is sent by workers on a monthly basis. And there are, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, tens of millions of such people around the world. Number 4 in the principles is welfare engagement, and that is an important protocol because when you have, as you often do, workers working away from home for years at a time, as again, I'm sure many of you are aware, workers on construction sites, for example, in the Middle East will frequently be away for 2 or even 3 years without going home. And often there will be problems at home. And it is important that those problems can be solved so that the workers are not worried sick about a relative or some issue at home. And FSI offers assistance with our in-country teams. And we have substantial in-country teams in all of the source countries in which we operate, which can then go out, investigate problems and try to help solve them without having to interrupt the worker whilst they're away at their job site. And that ties in with the assistance with management, whereby senior FSI staff will engage with the management teams of our clients in order to ensure that the workers that they have on site are being managed in a way that is not only ethically sound, but culturally sensitive, that they receive instructions in a language they can understand, that they are motivated and that they're happy, and that they have whatever problems that might arise solved quickly. And this, again, stems from the sort of military ethos of my colleagues and my former colleagues, which is based on a real commitment to good quality management and motivation of workers. And that also ties in with making sure that the employees are aware of their rights. Many will be aware that in some countries it is the normal practice for employees to have their passports confiscated, and in one particular case, for workers effectively to be the property of the bosses. We kick back obviously very hard against all of those practices, and we try to make sure, in fact we do make sure, that all of the employees that are employed through our systems are aware of their rights and know how to complain, and if there are problems they raise them with members of FSI staff or indeed with the employer directly. I'm conscious that I might be trespassing on the time of the next speaker, so I shall push quickly through the regulatory environment point, which is on my next slide. Julie has already mentioned the particular changes that have happened at the policy level over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. As I'm sure all know, it really kicked off with the California Act, but has been followed up by significant pieces of legislation, including, importantly, the UK Bribery Act and last year the Modern Slavery Act. But it's not just the legal changes, it's the commitment that has come from the highest level politically, particularly from President Obama, who in his executive order 13627 really raised the bar for human trafficking and forced labor issues by saying that no American dollar should be spent on slave labor, and that this was a major priority for the American government. And we are very grateful for his commitment. I should just add as an aside, when my colleagues and I at FSI would travel to Washington or to London in the early days of the company in 2006, 7, 8, we were received with what I might euphemistically call a polite audience. In other words, we were politely ignored. And we were told in terms by politicians, by lawyers, by NGOs and others that the agenda we were pursuing was all well and good. In fact, it was all good, but it was way ahead of its time, and that time would certainly come, but probably not for 4 or 5 years. And they were unerringly correct about that, because sure enough, 3 or 4 years later, and we would hope we had something to do with some of it, we then began to see these changes occur, and we're very pleased that they have started to occur, because we are now looking at a really significant change in the regulatory environment, which provides a platform for those companies that wish to push an ethical employment and management agenda to be able to go out and speak persuasively, not just about the benefits of ethical recruitment commercially, but also from a legal and regulatory position. I won't dwell on those pieces of legislation. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. But as I say on my next slide, the difficulty is now pulling together the policy and the reality. As I say, if you look at the Fault Lines documentary, you'll see that even on US government contracts, even notwithstanding the strong stance that the US government has taken on human trafficking matters, we still have a situation where there is nothing like the kind of transparency and accountability in the supply chains of companies working on US government contracts that there should be. I'm not going to name names. They are named in the documentary, and you can see them for yourselves. They're well-known American contractors who have fallen foul of human trafficking issues, sometimes not because, well, I think in every case, not because they want to, but because they are either incapable of making the checks that are needed to ensure that these sorts of things don't happen, or they simply don't feel as though they have to because the procurement process seems not to require them to do so. In fact, a couple of months ago, I was asked by FSI to prepare a white paper for the US government procurement team for the LOGCAP 5 program in Afghanistan. And I submitted a paper which contains 5 or 6 recommendations about the simple things that could be done in the process to try to ensure that greater transparency and accountability in recruitment occurs. So, for example, ensuring that rather than just ticking a box saying that you have seen the recruitment license of your subcontractor, but ensuring that that license is kept on file and followed up and checked and audited. Or, for example, that recruitment fees are not only promised but paid. Because, as you'll see in the documentary, one of the issues is that recruitment is meant to be a ring-fenced budgetary matter, and that is the basis of the bid. But more often than not, that money never gets paid. And again, we're talking about a worker pays model because that sits with the, if you like, the cultural and historical ways in which people have been recruited, and of course because it generates vast quantities of money on the black market. So really, what my current mission is to try and do my bit to pull together the ends of the rope, the policy end and the reality end. And I'm taking with me into my new organisation the sort of positive can-do attitude of FSI and the commercial attitude, where we say to businesses who are really who are the gatekeepers of the problem here, look, we want to work with you. We understand that you're in business to make money, but here's the thing: you can make money. In fact, you can make more money by being ethical, and it's not simply a question of how do you comply with a tiresome regulation, but how do you embrace real change so that your business model is not just a shining example of ethical practice, but actually puts more money in on your bottom line. And that brings me to my final slide, which is about the new organisation, the SPF. And as Judy said in her introduction, it's got two ends to it. It is a think tank, and the point is to become a centre of excellence and to try and generate new ways of thinking about human trafficking and forced labour issues. For example, using technology and new risk management tools in order to push down greater accountability and transparency in supply chains. But on the other hand, it is a commercial consultancy. It is there to engage with companies, particularly companies that have joint ventures in the Gulf or in South Asia, and try to ensure that they are embracing changes to their work practices so that they can hold their heads up high, they can sign their Modern Slavery Act compliance statements, and they can submit their documents to the US government, not just knowing that they are legally compliant, but that they are doing the right thing ethically. And that is something that a lot of the people that I have spoken to and my colleagues have spoken to really want to embrace. There seems to be something of a sea change, and this often happens when policy and the law take the lead, and then companies take their cue from seeing which way the political winds are blowing, and they start to change their practices. And it's my view that that will now start to happen. As Judy says, I'm writing a PhD thesis at King's College in London on which is all around these issues, and specifically is trying to demonstrate quantitatively the link between ethical business practices and improved commercial returns. We have said for years as FSI, when we go to speak to Saudi construction companies or Qatari engineering companies, look, this is good for your bottom line. And we were getting a bit sick and tired of having it thrown back in our face of, well, you can't prove that. In our view, what they were really saying, of course, was in our view, slavery pays. And my job over the next couple of years is to try to demonstrate that slavery does not pay, and that doing the right thing is good business. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for having me. There is, of course, because as ever, being a lawyer, I couldn't go anywhere without adding a disclaimer. You'll note my last slide, I'm not actually a director of FSI anymore, and I'm not here speaking on their behalf, as it were. I'm not binding the company. So if that is a company that sounds interesting to you and you'd like to know more, there is a website which is currently undergoing reconstruction, and you can contact the Chief Executive, Tristan Forster, at the URL listed there. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll hand you back to Christina.
Thank you very much, James, for talking about your phenomenal work, which has been really shifting and reframing the dialogue that's happening among other places in boardrooms across the globe and leading companies. You know, as you mentioned, there are companies who are aware that there is human trafficking in their supply chain, but I think largely there's a lack of awareness or even a belief that that does not exist in companies' supply chains. And so FSI has really been leading the way in incentivizing learning about these practices for companies, and then really providing concrete steps that employers can take and detailed technical assistance. So thank you for that overview, and I would encourage the audience to really check out FSI and their efforts. I want to remind the audience as well to keep your questions coming. We're excited about a robust dialogue and debate following the next presentation. And I'm going to move on to introducing Sandro Petineo, who is a policy advisor at the International Confederation of Private Employment Services at SIET. Among other things, he's responsible for relations with key international organizations, and I will go through some of the alphabet soup, but OECD, ILO, many of the organizations who you have heard about today, including IOM, and the EU. Right now, he's working on the implementation of a partnership with the ILO Fair Recruitment Initiative that promotes ethical recruitment in countries mentioned by James as well, South Asia and the Middle East. At the EU level, he's also working on a very interesting EU-funded project on social dialogue in the temporary agency work sector, which is a sector that's been particularly prone to abuse. I know in Massachusetts is an area where we're seeing increased exploitation and abuse of workers, and it's the same, unfortunately, abroad. He has a master's degree in international relations from the University of Florence and has worked extensively at and for Motorola, the European Commission, and the Council of the European Union. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sandro.
Well, thank you very much, Julie, for this generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be speaking at this webinar and to bring in the perspective of SIET. For those of you who don't know who we are, SIET is the International Confederation of Private Employment Services, and we represent at the global level the employment and recruitment industry. And we have two types of members. We have national federations of agencies, and we have 50 associations in 50 countries. But also we have another type of member that is the corporate members. And so 8 of the largest multinational companies and agencies, such as Adecco, Kelly Services, and Manpower Group, are also direct members to SIET. just to give you a little bit of context, we annually bring to the labor market around 61 million workers, and that can be a mix of arrangements, whether it is agency work or staffing, as it's known in the US, or permanent recruitment. Obviously, there's one element that has emerged already with the other speakers, and that is that a small portion of these workers are recruited internationally. And the reason why this is because the risks connected to international recruitment for a responsible business are very high. And so, thankfully, things are changing on this front, and we are seeing tremendous attention on the issue of recruitment, and there are many initiatives. Many have been already mentioned: the UN principles on human rights in business, the DACA principles, the IRIS, and so on. So I want to go into these, but in these initiatives, SIET has been involved. But I would focus on three, well, let's say two, because IRIS has been already presented. And SIET has been working with the IOM, is working with the ILO on the Fair Recruitment Initiative. And of course, the key document for us is our Code of Conduct, which is a set of principles, it's 10 principles, that ensure high quality standards to companies and to job seekers and workers. As you know, and James already mentioned it, we're in this business not for charity, but we want to be profitable, and this can be done in an ethical way. In fact, our main thinking behind it is that we cannot exploit workers, because that is not how we want to do things. And of course, working with people, if they are exploited, if they are unhappy, they will be less productive, they will be worried about other things than the job at hand, and so that would reflect badly on our way of doing business, and so we want to avoid this. And so why the SIET Code of Conduct is so important? Well, because with the principles that it outlines, you have basic ones like the respect for laws and regulation, international labor standards as well. But also there's specific provisions that are more linked to the issue of migration and human trafficking. And one is the no fee charging to the job seekers. Clara mentioned it already, that we believe that the fees should be paid by the client and not by the job seekers. Because if the job seekers pay, they are exposed to vulnerabilities to debt and to worse exploitation. So we don't believe in that. Other principles of the Code of Conduct do protect workers on health and safety, freedom of association, and so on. What is interesting of the SIET Code of Conduct is that these principles are respected by all of our members, so the corporate members, the 8 big multinationals, but also our national federations in 50 countries, and their members, so their agencies as well. And what is important, and this is something that has been already touched upon, is the issue of regulation and enforcement. These principles do apply even in countries where you have no regulation whatsoever, or on the industry, or you have regulation that allows agencies to charge fees. So even in countries such as India, the Philippines, and so on, our members do not charge the fees, even if it is allowed. And this is very important because we think that regulation, on the one hand, should be key in leveling the market for the good and ethical recruitment agencies. And it should be a way to oust the unscrupulous one. And this is something that we are doing with the ILO and our partnership for the Fair Recruitment Initiative. What we are trying to do, and this is in 5 countries, they are India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Jordan, and Lebanon. We are promoting better regulation on the industry, and that is for us ILO Convention 181. And also, we are trying to organize the industry in national federations as well. And these 2 elements are very important, because if we don't have any regulation on the industry, it means that there is no way for you to, first of all, separate the good actors from the bad. And so, tomorrow I can bring my phone, open up shop, and put up a sign, and boom, I'm an agency. And that is often what happens. But of course, to run a professional business, to run a professional agency, it's much more than that. And often we see that abuses are done by improvised organization, if at all. I mean, often it is one person with a phone, and they do send people abroad, or they place people even internally at the national level, and that's not how it should be done. So for us, one way to address that is by establishing appropriate regulation, and that is Convention 181 on private employment agencies. Among the provisions of the convention, you have, of course, the principle of fee charging, that it should be paid by the employers. So again, it is a system to encourage more the ethical recruitment agencies to gain more market and more business. Because again, what you see in countries where we do not charge fees, but it is allowed, or there is no regulation whatsoever, then we are facing unfair competition for those that are offering cheaper services because they're charging fees to the workers. Again, it is not the belief of SET that the money should come from the workers, because that's not fair, it's not sustainable, and it's not good. But you do understand that if there is an environment, a legal environment or a regulatory environment that promotes that kind of practice, we are losing market, and it's not how it should be. So we promote Convention 181 and regulation. But the other element that we do promote is the professionalization of the industry. And so what we see is that if you have the industry that is organized in a national federation that is professional, that can take responsibility for the industry and represent the industry with the government, with the trade unions, with the society at large, in fact, that is very good, because you can be responsible for the industry on the one hand, but on the other, what you do, your function is to clean up and ensure that your members, your agencies, are operating correctly and professionally. And for example, this is what we do at SET at the international level. So we do not accept members that charge fees, for example, but also our members, our national federations in countries. Again, I mentioned India, but it could be Vietnam and Indonesia, you name it. They make sure that their members are respecting these principles, and they're not opening the gates to other agencies or other actors that are unscrupulous. At the same time, because we are intermediaries, the role of the national federation is also to cater the needs of the workers. And so there is a function of information to the workers, telling them that they shouldn't pay fees, they shouldn't be charged, and so on. So focusing on these 2 elements is very important for us, because it is a way to, first of all, ensure that the good agencies gain market, and the other thing is that they are better separate from the rogue actors. And at the same time, it is also a matter of making sure that the industry grows, but it's not any industry, it is the good one, because if it is appropriately regulated and responsible, you will have, the industry serves a good function in the labor market, making matching of labor supply and demand much more effective. So for us, it is key to ensure regulation and better differentiation of the good players from the bad. And I think that with the different initiatives, the IOM, the guiding principles on human rights in business, and of course with the support of the companies, which should also take their responsibility and should be prepared to bear the cost. And we've seen different examples. In the US, HP and Apple have adopted the no fee charging policy. This is very good for us, and it does give an incentive to continue on this path of responsible business. So with that, I think I'm done, and so I will give the floor back to Julie and Christina. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sandro. This is helpful, I think, in highlighting the importance and the impact of coalition building, the really groundbreaking work that CIET is doing in terms of identifying shared goals, but also reinforcing ethical practice, like you mentioned, in terms of fee charging. So thank you. So right now I'm excited, we have a number of questions from the audience, so we're going to go ahead and transition to questions from the audience, but I would encourage you to continue to send in your questions, and hopefully we will get to most, if not all of them. So I'm going to start with a question from Anna, who asks, do your organizations focus specifically on practices technically defined as human trafficking or modern-day slavery, or does it include oppressive labor practices more generally? And I'm going to ask Sandro to answer this question, and maybe also to address if you do, if the initiative does address other types of practices, what is the utility of also focusing on labor exploitation more generally?
Well, I think that labor exploitation comes with the territory, and of course, when you're dealing with workers and employers and so on, you do face issues of labor exploitation. What we see is that, first of all, we engage with different actors as well. For example, the ILO, but also civil society organizations such as Verite. And you mentioned in one of the slides the work that Manpower has done with the ethical framework for cross-border labor recruitment. This is very, very important for us. We are very aware of the situation on the impact of agencies and recruitment agencies with labor exploitation. But at the same time, what I have to say is that it is we're very cautious. And so because CIET has been around for 50 years almost, we're very cautious not to engage in dangerous situations. I know it sounds very, selfish, if you will, but we have a name to protect, because CIET means quality of services, but also ethical treatment of workers. So we tend to operate in countries where you do have regulation, you do have enforcement of regulation, and so namely the major portion of our members comes from Europe, where you have good system of regulation, and so it is. We are very aware of the risks, but we also try to keep a buffer between us and the risks, because we need to maintain a clean image. However, we dip our toes in different initiatives where we think that there is some advantage for everyone. So the ILO Fair Recruitment Initiative is one. The IOM IRIS is another, and we think that working together we can help the industry transition to a better model to remain profitable. So that is what we're doing. Let me think if there is. No, I think I'll leave it at that. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Sandro. We're going to transition to a couple of more specific questions about the IRIS program and how it functions. And for that, I'm going to ask Clara to answer these questions. So we have two questions, one from Tu and one from Travis. When will IRIS be available to recruitment agencies, and how does IRIS market itself? Essentially, what is the business model to the private industry?
Thank you for the questions. When will IRIS be available to recruitment agencies? It's a hard question. For the time being, as we said, we are finalizing the standard and the certification process, and we are looking into the first pilots already in 2016. The idea that we had in mind and the idea that we share, the idea we discussed with the stakeholders is to start implementing IRIS little by little, to start with those migration corridors where there's already sound, robust legislation, and IRIS' role is complementing that legislation and helping to identify those that are beyond the bar, to explain in a maybe common way. Then the question, when will IRIS be available to recruitment agencies as a stand-alone certification that a recruitment agency can directly apply? I think we can safely say that for the next 2-3 years, we'll be in the process of piloting and perfectioning the certification. While we'll already be working with the recruitment industry, obviously. So there'll be already recruitment intermediaries that will be trying the IRIS certification, but I don't know if that is really answering the question. But I would say that especially for the next 2-3 years, we'll be more in a pilot phase place rather than a complete standing on its own certification organization.
Thank you, Clara. And I think our next question actually goes to the flip side, moving from how do you market the program to companies in terms of ensuring accountability. So this is a question from Travis asking, how does FSI specifically ensure accountability with their clientele? And for that, I would ask James to answer.
Very good question, Chris. And it's really at the heart of the business because if I've understood your question correctly, it really is about how do we make sure that we're not being spun? How does FSI make sure it's not being used as a fig leaf or a cover for bad practice? And also, how do we make sure that we hold our clients' feet to the fire? Well, the short answer is by the significant medium and long-term engagement with that client. We very rarely get involved in what the military might call fire and forget type recruitment, where we simply go out and recruit people and hand them over. The model is much more geared towards a positive, long-term, sustainable engagement with that client. So, if you recall, during my presentation, I spoke about the 5 or 6 stages and principles that we go through. So, for example, in terms of payroll payments, those would be done by FSI with copies open to the client and open to external audit. In terms of the ongoing management, senior FSI personnel are regularly in contact with the projects that our recruits are working on. In some cases, that's a daily occurrence. Sometimes it's a weekly or a monthly occurrence. We have senior staff that attend the projects personally, even those projects that are in high threat locations. And just on that point, we have a very specific policy, which is that we don't send any recruit to any location that we wouldn't personally go to. So I have spent quite large portions of the last decade of my life hanging out in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Djibouti and Somalia, all sorts of fun places. Not that we necessarily have people in those places, but so, for example, in the case of Yemen, I decided, having been there and having taken account of the particular circumstances prevailing at that time, that it would not be within our risk profile to deploy people there. And so we take a sensible approach to the compliance of our clients. If we understand, if evidence comes to our notice that a client is not behaving in accordance with the FSI Code of Conduct and Principles, then we would initially raise it at a very senior level, have urgent discussions with the client to determine exactly what has gone wrong and how and why, and put in place an urgent plan to fix any issues that might arise. If a client was being a serial offender in terms of abuse of workers' rights, we would terminate a contract with them. When we've done that previously with a client who initially looked very favourable, but then after a short period of time was demonstrating behaviour that we felt was not compatible with FSI's business ethics, and so at some cost of the company, we took the decision not to engage with them further, which is a difficult decision, not just because it cost us some money, but actually more importantly because we felt that we were walking away from a situation where we could perhaps have done some good, but we felt that the individuals involved in that particular company at that time were not sufficiently committed to change to ensure that that was likely to happen. So the short answer, Travis, to a good question is by holding them close and engaging them for a long time.
Thank you, James. We're actually now going to move to a distinct question from Anna. Are any of you working directly with employers in the fishing and seafood industries? And I think this question also gets at, do any of your organizations set priorities to work in industries where they are particularly prone to trafficking or forced labor? And for this, I wanted to initially at least ask the question of Sandro.
Yes, thank you for the question. I would say no to both parts of the questions. I'm not aware of any work done in fishery sector because most of our market is more professional level workers. So that would be no, and in general, as I said, no to risk-prone sectors either. We tend to steer away from that, except when we have we work in specific projects because we want to insulate what we're doing from for a business perspective thing to the more ethical developing or capacity building part of our business. So I would say no.
Thank you, Sandro. It's interesting. It highlights some of the challenges in engaging in those more difficult markets. And I wonder if Clara could share any experience, if you have it, in those industries.
I mean, it will be hard for me to speak in the name of IOM because IOM is a very big organization. To my knowledge, I don't think we've been working directly with employers in the fishing and seafood industries. I do believe that IOM, especially IOM in Indonesia, has been working a lot in the protection of migrant workers and the protection of vulnerable migrants in that area of the world, and most probably many of them may have been affected or may have been exploited. I mean, for me, it's hard to say that there's any industry that is more specifically affected by human trafficking and labor exploitation, because we know that human trafficking, labor exploitation affects every industry. So then, obviously, the case of the fishing and seafood industries is very, especially the last reports that we have, they're devastating. But when somebody asks me the question, where is slavery, I always answer slavery is everywhere around you. Everywhere where you let your eyes, there's slavery there. So I think there was also a question, how does the IRIS, to respond to a question that was before made, I think, how does the IRIS market itself as well to the private industry? I believe we've moved from denial to more awareness among generally every industry. But I think the real challenge is moving to greater awareness and greater commitment from those industries that are not based on consumer goods. I think still the fishing and seafood industry is very touched by consumer awareness. But this is my question actually to the group. How can we improve the commitment from those industries that are not so exposed to consumer opinion? I'm sorry, I just wanted to get a chance to ask that.
That's a great question, and I'm wondering if James might be willing to answer Clara's very simple question.
Thanks, Clara. Do you want me to also attack the fishing and risk-prone industry sectors or not?
That would be fantastic.
Just very quickly, the short answer is no to fishing and seafood, albeit we have done some work in maritime security and shipping. But I'm not being flippant about it. I recognise that there are some substantial issues in the fishing industries. It's just not something that we've had a client involved in. Risk-prone sectors, we see anywhere that there are large numbers of lower skilled or semi-skilled workers tends to be an area that is more vulnerable because the workers are often perhaps less able to defend themselves in terms of their knowledge of their rights, etc. So specifically in the Middle East, which is an area I know well, the construction and engineering sectors, the domestic household sector, oil and gas. Again, there tends to be the higher up the value chain you get, the less problematic it is because typically the jobs on offer tend to be more skilled, the operatives tend to be better educated, and as a result, less likely to be prone to the sort of exploitation that we see so regularly. In terms of Clara's excellent question, what can we do about sectors less exposed? It's a difficult one because obviously a lot of the push factor from our side in terms of trying to improve conditions implicitly or explicitly relies on the I'm going to call it the threat of exposure, but I don't really mean it in threatening terms. But obviously, in this interconnected world of ours, social media, etc., companies do have to have a care about their reputations. And so it makes it that much easier if you do have that implied threat in your back pocket. For those industries that don't, I think you still engage in the same sort of, if you like, tactics that I've spoken about with the SPF. So it is about appealing to their commercial nature and about trying to encourage them to see this as an issue of profitability as much as ethics. And so rather than coming at it from an exposure or auditing perspective, both of which I think have a great deal of merit and value, you come at it from a self-interested perspective, and you say to people, if you do things the right way, then notwithstanding the fact that you're compliant and all the rest of it, you'll actually be making more money. That would be my suggestion, but I don't know if Sandra has any better ones.
Shall we throw it over to Sandro to add a couple of thoughts?
Well, let me think. No, I think that James nailed it, in fact, and it is a matter of making the business case why you should be ethical. I mean, it's not an end in itself; it's just a means to be more successful in business. And I remember when I was in January in Nepal talking to some of the stakeholders, including agencies and so on. The key argument that wins them over is money, and so making sure that they understand that in the longer run, they will be more profitable by engaging with clients or contractors that are ethical. But of course, you have to take into account the transition period as well. And as it was said, the reputational risks are also something that can be very convincing. So I think it's a matter of combination of the carrot and stick business case plus a scandal that usually works.
Great, Sandro. Thank you for adding your comments. So now we're going to a question actually for me. What has been your experience with representing labor migrants as human trafficking victims? And this is a great question and dovetails really nicely with the conversation we've had thus far, in that through the BU Human Trafficking Clinic, we represent labor trafficking survivors in the United States. And that's in a variety of sectors, whether it's domestic workers, in the carnival sector, in temporary work, in the hotel sector as well. And I think one of the interesting points is across these sectors, what we have seen is these unfair recruitment practices that are occurring both at country of origin and then throughout, so that there might be other countries in which people are either working or transiting. And what are those practices that we're seeing? Those which have been mentioned throughout the panel, whether it's fees that are being charged, contracts that are incorrect or fraudulent, contracts that may extend for long periods of time and have fees associated with them. And so I think this work just bears out the need for efforts to combat unethical practices. And the other point I'll just quickly make is we've seen in many of our cases, there's this aspect of re-victimization. So where you have a very vulnerable workforce that do eventually return home and then find that they have no other option but, again, to go abroad, even though they're aware at that point of the risk, because there are unfortunately no options for them for employment, or they may be facing some form of persecution. And so these efforts are so important, because if these potential employees had information about the placements, knew that they would face trafficking or exploitation, they would likely choose other placements, and this potentially provides them with safe work placements. So I think it just echoes the work that's being done here. So now we're going to move in a slightly different direction to a question specifically for James about technology and how technology can supplement the efforts that you have here. So this is a question from Amantia, who asks, is there a role for technology in the ethical recruitment sector? Do you know of any existing ventures, or is there a type of technology that does not exist now and could be developed to address this?
That's a really good question, Amantia. Thanks very much. And it gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about a piece of technology that I'm developing with some colleagues in the UK at the moment, about which I will be slightly reticent, if you don't mind, on the basis that there are some intellectual property matters to deal with. But the short answer is yes, I think there is. And I think technology has a huge part to play. And really what it comes down to for me is this point that Clara, Sandra, and I have all made in our own way, which is the opportunity of an ability of increasing accountability and transparency further and further down the supply chain. And so the specific problem that I'm trying to address at the moment is how to ensure that decision makers, when it comes to recruitment of workers, decision makers are held accountable. And there are risk management tools that currently exist, but I don't think that they are particularly user-friendly when it comes to this sort of thing. Some of you, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the Bitcoin phenomenon, which is based on a piece of technology called blockchain. And without turning this into a blockchain seminar, which at this time of day would be wholly unnecessary, I think that is a potentially revolutionary piece of tech, because it helps with the transparency and accountability of decision making down the chain. And really, I mean, this is not in conceptual terms, this isn't particularly new, because all it's trying to do is drive down, further down, this idea of accountability and transparency, so that if a particular person on a particular date makes a particular decision, and that decision is subsequently discovered to have given rise to an exploitative situation, then that individual can be identified, no matter how long after the date. And I think that a little bit like the issue with sort of social media accountability, eventually this starts to have an impact on behavior, because people, corrupt people, will make a calculation. I'll make a basic calculation. Is this worth it? And regrettably, I'm sure some people will continue to come to the conclusion that the significant sums of money on offer do make corruption and extortion and violence and all of the other problems that come with human trafficking, that does make it worth it. But my view is that the more transparent you can make decision-making processes, the more likely you are to be able to prevent people from taking wrong decisions, and the more likelihood there is of being able to inculcate into a corporate culture a sense of responsibility. And even if people aren't doing the right thing for ethical reasons, even if they're only watching their own back, then at least that's better than the previous situation. So yes, Amantia, I think there is a lot that can be done. It's something that we're working on, and I very much hope that others will join in the race, because I think technology has a big part to play.
Thank you, James, for that window into these exciting new approaches. We look forward to hearing more in the days and weeks to come. So we now have our final question from two, and I'm going to ask this question of Clara, although others can join in. How do all the initiatives shared by the panelists coordinate and/or collaborate with one another to prevent redundancy and to promote scale?
Thank you, Judy, and thank you too for the question. Well, as I said during my presentation, the IRIS initiative is it's been incubated within IOM. That is a multi-stakeholder initiative, and we believe we are all IRIS. And when I say we are all IRIS, we are glad to count with experts such as CED, such as FSI, that come to our meetings, that help us embed their practices into the IRIS certification, and to ensure that we are promoting coherence and alignment among all those initiatives. And I think there's a space for everything and for everybody, because sadly, what we are discussing today is not the business model that exists worldwide. And we are quite far of us, as I think both Sandro and James have said and repeated. The problem is that many companies believe that slavery sells well, and slavery is a profitable business. So to change that business culture, I think we need all the efforts and all possible initiatives.
Thank you, and thanks for highlighting. I think this webinar is so important because it highlights the need for collaboration and how individual organizations can make different but important impacts. So now I'm going to ask the panelists actually to offer just a couple of closing remarks related either to their presentations or questions that we have had. And I'll start with Sandro, and followed by James and then Clara.
Well, thank you for this. I would just say that on the issue of duplications and so on, it is true that there are a lot of initiatives, but at the same time, we're trying to work as much as possible with everyone together, because otherwise we become mad following this initiative, that one. We do work to harmonize as much as possible. And on the closing remarks, I would say that I would keep in mind the principles on business and human rights, which outline the responsibilities of the states and the business as well. And let's not forget that in order to get to a better place, at least for the perspective of the industry, but obviously it trickles down to the workers as well and to other businesses, is that states need to take the responsibility in setting up regulation, but also enforcing it, because again, if you adopt regulation and then it's a piece of paper, it's not very useful. But at the same time, that is a way for the business, for the professional businesses, to be recognized and to be operating in an environment that is conducive to ethical practices. So I think that the role of regulation is to be kept in mind. The other thing is that let's not lump everyone together. I mean, this has come out from the discussion, but there are agencies that are not evil. There are agencies that want to do the right thing, and the long-standing commitment of SEAT members, but also FSI and others should be recognized more. I know that the abuses make the headlines much more, but there are also good companies that want to do the right thing. So I think that that should be acknowledged as well. With that, thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think we're going to shift to James for some final comments.
Thanks very much. I'm going to conclude on a resolutely upbeat note, following on from Sandra's last comments there, with which I wholly agree. I think that we're entering a new era, and I think that it's not the battle is by no means won, but the combination of the hugely positive changes in the policy environment, together with a growing recognition by companies, by entrepreneurs, by NGOs and others around the world, that this problem has to be tackled. I think we're getting there. And I think it is starting to be recognized that you can no longer turn a blind eye or a deaf ear to the suffering and misery of millions of people around the world. People won't have it. We now live in a globally interconnected world where if a multinational company is found to have exploited their workers, it becomes headline news in a matter of minutes. And I think this is moving behavior, and I'm really pleased about it. But having said that, there is a long way to go. If any of you have the misfortune to visit a labor camp in one of the less regulated parts of the Middle East, you will see immediately and at first hand the problem that we face. It's not a battle that's won, and there are people who are very hard to reach, but we're doing our best to reach them. And I really think that with the policy tools that we now have at our disposal, and with the interest of and help from good people such as yourselves, then I think we can start to make a real difference. I'm pleased that FSI has played a small part, hopefully, in making some of that change. I'm committed to continuing my work in trying to make a difference. I see more and more people coming out of the good universities wanting to dedicate their lives to helping others, and I take great heart from that. And I think perhaps in 5 years' time we'll come back and we'll be having a very different conversation, maybe still a difficult one, but hopefully one that is a little better than it is now. Thanks very much for listening today. I hope it's been of interest, and if any of you wishes to contact me, then you can do so either via FSI or on my usual contact details, which I'm sure will be made available. Thanks.
Thank you, James, for that resounding note of optimism. We often need that infused in the trafficking discourse, and it is exciting, the work that's being done. So with that, I will pass it along to Clara for some final remarks.
Well, basically, James has said it all, so I don't have much left to say. I'm also I think we have gone a long, long way. I think today, with the new legislations in place, with the amazing work of my fellow panelists are doing, and hopefully the work the IRIS will achieve, the work of others, well, the ILO work that I want to mention as well. I think we are at an amazing point in history in moving forward on anti-slavery, on counter-trafficking, And I mean, I know step by step, little by little, but I'm sure we're getting there. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I'm sure we're getting there. And as James said, we are getting into a new era, and I'm very excited that I get to live this as well. And again, thank you very much for this invitation. And if anybody in the audience wants to ask any question, has any doubts, please just don't hesitate to send me an email.
So I want to say thank you to not only Babson and the Global Initiative, but our esteemed panelists, not only for their words, but for really the trailblazing work that they have been doing and continue to do. And I would encourage the audience really to check out these initiatives on their websites and to connect with the panelists if you would like more information. I also would like to remind the audience that this presentation is being recorded and will be available online, both in terms of the audio recording and the slides. And with that, I want to turn it back over to Christina Bain to make some final remarks herself.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to our dynamic panelists for such an engaging and insightful conversation today. We're so grateful for the work that you all do in the field each and every day, and thank you for lending us your expertise for this extraordinary discussion. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us for 2 hours and for your fantastic questions. And I just wanted to give an announcement that our next webinar in our series is going to be on Thursday, April 14th. We're going to be focusing on minerals, conflict minerals, and illicit goods in the supply chain. And that's going to be from 10 o'clock a.m. to 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, and then 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock p.m. Central European Time. And we hope you'll join us for that. This is the second webinar, the one today, the second webinar in our series on labor standards, supply chains, and human trafficking. We're going to be having one of these once a month until July, so we hope that you'll join us for a few or all in the series. Thank you again, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. Bye-bye.